Some stories are so dark they feel cursed, as if time itself tried to bury them. In the shadowed streets of 19th century Puebla, a single decision shattered the boundary between motherhood and monstrosity. This is not just history. It is a whisper from the past that still carries the weight of guilt, fear, and an unspoken horror that refuses to stay silent. The debt did not begin as a number, but as a slow suffocation. It crept into the house with empty cupboards, unpaid rent, and the dull ache of hunger that refused to leave even in sleep. In Puebla in 1881, debt was not an abstract concept discussed in offices or banks. It was a living presence that sat beside the poor, watched them eat less each day, and waited patiently for the moment they could no longer resist. Money was scarce, work unreliable, and illness or bad harvests could turn a struggling family into prisoners of obligation overnight. Once the debt was acknowledged, it followed the debtor everywhere, spoken of in whispers by neighbors and enforced loudly by those who held power. The lender did not need to raise his voice. His authority was already understood. He represented a system where mercy was weakness and delay was defiance. Every missed payment added weight to the debt, not only financially but socially. The debtor became marked, avoided by others who feared being pulled into the same abyss. Doors closed, favors vanished, and the community that once shared bread now shared silence. In this world, owing money meant owing obedience, submission, and eventually something far more valuable than coins. For a woman already pushed to the edge, the debt transformed from fear into inevitability. Each day without payment felt like a countdown, each visit from the collector a reminder that excuses had expired. There were no courts to appeal to, no protections for the desperate. The law favored those who owned land, money, or influence, and the poor were expected to pay not only with labor, but with compliance. When labor failed and possessions were exhausted, the human body itself became collateral, especially the bodies of those with no voice or status. The idea that blood could replace money was not spoken openly, yet everyone understood it. Children were considered extensions of the household, not individuals with rights, and in extreme poverty they were viewed as assets to be used for survival. Apprenticeships, domestic servitude, and informal transfers of children were common, blurring the line between necessity and exploitation. What made this debt unforgiving was not only its size but its timing. It arrived when there was nothing left to give except flesh and future. The mother knew the debt would not wait. Hunger had already stripped her pride, and fear had eroded her resolve. Each night she listened to her child breathe and wondered how long before that sound would be replaced by the knock at the door. The lender did not threaten violence, he did not need to. His calm certainty was worse because it left no room for hope. He simply reminded her that debts must be paid one way or another, and that the consequences of refusal would be far harsher than cooperation. In a society shaped by rigid hierarchy and moral hypocrisy, the blame would fall entirely on her. Poverty was treated as failure and desperation as moral weakness. If she resisted, she risked losing everything anyway, possibly through force, imprisonment, or public disgrace. If she complied, the debt would vanish, at least on paper, and survival might continue for those left behind. The calculation was cruel and precise, stripping the situation of emotion and reducing it to grim arithmetic. What made this debt demand blood was its indifference to human bonds. Love had no currency in this transaction. Motherhood held no sacred protection when weighed against financial obligation. The system did not see a child, only a solution. The lender saw an asset that could be transferred, sold, or controlled, and the law would look away because such arrangements were hidden behind euphemisms and tradition. The community would whisper but not intervene, relieved that the debt was not theirs. In that moment, the debt ceased to be about money and became about power. It demonstrated who could take and who must give, who could demand and who must surrender. The mother's choice was not truly a choice, but the final step in a process that had been narrowing her options for months, perhaps years. By the time blood replaced coins, the outcome had already been decided by hunger, inequality, and silence. The tragedy lies not only in what was taken, but in how ordinary it was made to seem. No alarms were raised, no records detailed the exchange, no prayers were said for the price that was paid. The debt was settled, the ledger balanced, and life moved on as if nothing sacred had been violated, leaving behind a truth too dark to confront openly, that in this unforgiving world, survival could demand a sacrifice that stained everyone involved forever. The choice the mother faced was not sudden, nor was it born from cruelty, but from a slow erosion of everything that once defined her as human. Motherhood, in the moral language of the time, was praised as sacred, selfless, and divinely ordained, yet in practice it offered no protection when poverty tightened its grip. Society demanded that women sacrifice endlessly for their children, but it offered them no mercy when sacrifice became impossible. Trapped between hunger and judgment, the mother's love was forced into a shape that no longer resembled love at all. Each day she woke with the same question echoing in her mind: how long can a child survive when there is nothing left to give? The decision was not framed as betrayal, but as survival twisted into necessity. To keep one child alive, another future had to be surrendered. In her world, faith taught obedience and endurance, not resistance. Prayer became routine, not hope, and even the church that preached compassion stood aligned with those who held power. Confession could absolve sins, but it could not erase debt. The mother's mind became a battlefield where instinct and fear fought without rest. Every glance at her daughter was followed by guilt so heavy it felt physical, yet every empty plate reinforced the same conclusion. The child's laughter, once a reminder of purpose, became a painful echo of what could not be protected. Love did not disappear, but it was crushed under the weight of reality, reshaped into something desperate and unrecognizable. Nature itself seemed to accuse her. The bond between mother and child is meant to be unbreakable, written into flesh and blood, yet here it was being negotiated like property. The horror of the choice lay in its inversion of what was considered natural. Instead of shielding her child from harm, she was being asked to deliver her into it. This was not simply a personal failure, but a reflection of a society that placed survival above morality and then punished those who survived by impossible means. The act defied faith as much as it defied nature. A mother was expected to suffer, to starve if necessary, but never to surrender her child. Yet starvation does not come with noble imagery when it is prolonged and humiliating. It comes with weakness, sickness, and the slow death of everyone involved. The mother understood that refusal did not guarantee safety, only a different kind of destruction. In that realization, the line between sin and survival blurred until it vanished entirely. What made the decision monstrous in the eyes of history was the silence that followed it. No one rushed to intervene. No authority questioned the arrangement. No neighbor spoke up in defense of the child. The mother was left alone with her choice, isolated by shame and fear. In that isolation, morality became abstract, something discussed by those who never faced such desperation. For her, morality had become a luxury she could no longer afford. The moment of agreement was not marked by rage or tears, but by numbness. When the words were spoken, they felt unreal, as if someone else was speaking through her mouth. This dissociation was a shield, a way to survive the unbearable weight of what she was doing. She convinced herself that the child might live better elsewhere, that suffering could be temporary, that fate had already decided what she could not change. These thoughts were not lies born of cruelty, but defenses against a truth too painful to face directly. In choosing this path, the mother did not escape punishment. Her sentence was internal and lifelong. Every breath afterward carried the memory of that moment, every sound a reminder of what had been lost. Society might label her heartless, history might reduce her to a symbol of betrayal, but neither captured the complexity of her torment. She lived with the knowledge that she had violated something sacred, even if the world around her had forced her hand. This choice did not free her from suffering, it merely transformed it. Hunger might ease, debt might vanish, but guilt took their place, more persistent and more cruel. The horror of the decision was not confined to the act itself, but extended into every day that followed, shaping her existence into a quiet penance that no confession could erase, a living contradiction of love and loss that continued long after the exchange was made. Puebla in 1881 was a city of contrasts so sharp they cut into the lives of those who walked its streets. Grand churches rose above crowded neighborhoods, their bells calling the faithful to prayer while poverty crouched in the alleys below. Faith was visible everywhere, carved into stone and woven into daily rituals, yet it coexisted with a quiet brutality that was rarely acknowledged. The city presented itself as orderly and devout, but beneath that surface lay a hierarchy that determined whose suffering mattered and whose could be ignored without consequence. For the poor, life moved according to rules that were never written down but always enforced. Survival depended on obedience to landowners, merchants, and lenders who controlled access to work and credit. A single misfortune could unravel an entire household, and once that happened, recovery was nearly impossible. Poverty was not treated as a shared failure of society, but as a personal flaw, something shameful that justified harsh treatment. In this environment, compassion existed more as an idea than a practice. Superstition thrived alongside religion, filling the gaps where explanation and justice were absent. Misfortune was often attributed to curses, divine punishment, or inherited sin, rather than structural inequality. This belief system made it easier to accept cruelty as destiny. If a family fell into ruin, it was whispered that they had done something to deserve it. Such thinking protected those in power from guilt and placed the burden of blame squarely on the victims. Women occupied a particularly vulnerable position within this structure. Expected to be obedient daughters, faithful wives, and self-sacrificing mothers, they were given responsibility without authority. Their labor was undervalued, their suffering normalized, and their choices constrained by both economic dependence and social judgment. A woman without resources or protection was exposed to exploitation from every direction, and her reputation was often the only currency she possessed. Once that reputation was damaged by poverty or debt, her worth in the eyes of society diminished rapidly. Children, especially those born into poor households, existed in a gray area between family and property. They were loved, yet also understood as potential labor, future income, or leverage in times of crisis. Formal laws might have condemned outright slavery, but informal systems of servitude and exchange continued under different names. Apprenticeships could turn into lifelong bondage, domestic service into silent imprisonment. The line between opportunity and exploitation was thin and easily crossed, particularly when transactions occurred behind closed doors. The collision of poverty and power was most visible in moments of crisis. Those with influence could bend moral rules to their advantage, while those without it were expected to accept their fate quietly. Institutions that claimed moral authority, including the church and local officials, often reinforced this imbalance by prioritizing order over justice. As long as social stability was maintained and debts were settled, the suffering of individuals remained an acceptable cost. In such a city, fear was a constant companion. Fear of hunger, fear of shame, fear of punishment, fear of being noticed in the wrong way. This fear shaped decisions long before they were made, narrowing possibilities until only the most desperate options remained. When survival required surrender, the environment ensured that surrender felt inevitable rather than imposed. Puebla's streets bore witness to countless silent tragedies like this one, each hidden behind walls and traditions that discouraged interference. Neighbors might sense something was wrong, but they had learned that involvement carried risks of its own. Silence became a form of self-preservation, and indifference a learned behavior. Over time, this collective silence allowed horrors to become routine, absorbed into the background of daily life. The power structures of the city did not need to announce themselves through violence. Their strength lay in normalization. When inequality is constant, it becomes invisible. When exploitation is common, it loses its shock. By 1881, this system had refined itself to the point where an act that should have shattered the moral foundation of the community could occur without disrupting its surface calm. This is the world in which the tragedy unfolded, not as an anomaly, but as a product of its environment. Puebla did not create monsters in the traditional sense, but it created conditions where ordinary people were driven to unthinkable acts. The horror was not hidden in shadows or legends, but embedded in everyday life, sustained by faith without compassion, order without justice, and a social structure that quietly decided who could be sacrificed for the sake of stability. The child at the center of this story did not begin life with a name that carried weight or meaning, only one that would later be whispered with fear and contempt. She was marked not by anything she had done, but by what had been done around her, by decisions made in voices she barely understood. Before she could form words, before she could understand blame or innocence, shame had already settled over her like a shadow that would follow her everywhere. In a society that believed suffering was inherited, she became a vessel for disgrace she never chose. Children in her position were rarely seen as individuals. They were defined by circumstance, by the status of their parents, by the rumors that clung to them. Once the exchange was made, her identity shifted instantly. She was no longer simply a daughter, but a reminder of a debt paid in flesh. The label attached to her erased the possibility of neutrality. She was not pitied nor protected, only observed with a mixture of curiosity and revulsion. The community did not ask what she felt or feared, only what she represented. The name she was given was not a gift, but a sentence. It reduced her existence to a single word that implied corruption, as if misfortune itself had chosen her body as a home. Words held immense power in that era, shaping perception more strongly than truth. Once spoken, they became reality. To call her cursed was to justify whatever happened next, to strip away the discomfort of responsibility and replace it with inevitability. As she grew, she learned her place not through instruction, but through reaction. The way voices lowered when she entered a room, the way eyes lingered a moment too long before turning away. Laughter stopped abruptly, conversations shifted, doors closed more quickly. She absorbed these signals long before she could interpret them, internalizing the idea that her presence disrupted something fragile. Shame was taught without words, reinforced through silence and distance. There was no space for innocence in her world. Childhood was shortened by awareness, by the constant sense that she was being judged by a past she could not remember. Even kindness, when offered, carried an edge of caution, as if it might invite contamination. Adults spoke of her future with resignation, never possibility. Expectations were lowered, not out of mercy, but out of assumption. Whatever path she walked was already imagined as dark. The cruelty of this marking lay in its permanence. Unlike hunger or illness, shame did not pass. It adapted, finding new ways to express itself as she aged. What began as avoidance turned into suspicion, then into open contempt. Any misstep was seen as confirmation of what people already believed. If she cried, it was because she was ungrateful. If she was silent, it was because she was plotting. She was denied the benefit of complexity that others took for granted. Her body became a site of projection, a place where the fears and superstitions of the community settled. In a culture steeped in religious symbolism and folklore, a child like her was easily transformed into an omen. Misfortune nearby could be linked to her presence, whispered as cause rather than coincidence. This belief system offered comfort to those who needed an explanation for their own suffering, even if it required sacrificing her humanity. What made her story especially cruel was the absence of witnesses willing to see her as more than a symbol. No one documented her thoughts, no one recorded her voice. History preserved the outline of what happened to her, but not who she was. She existed in fragments, defined by rumor and outcome rather than experience. The label erased her interior life completely, leaving only a hollow figure shaped by other people's narratives. She learned early that resistance only reinforced her isolation. Compliance became a survival strategy, silence a form of protection. In this way, the shame imposed on her succeeded in reshaping her behavior, turning accusation into self-fulfilling prophecy. The community saw what it expected to see, and she became what she needed to be in order to endure. This is how a child becomes a ghost long before death, present but unseen, spoken about but never spoken to. Her story is not remembered for who she was, but for what others needed her to represent. She was not born cursed, yet she lived inside a curse constructed by fear, power, and convenience, carrying a burden too heavy for any child to bear, and walking forward into a life already defined by a name she never chose. What lingered after the debt was settled was not relief, but an unease that settled into the city like damp air that never fully dried. The transaction may have erased numbers from a ledger, but it introduced a presence that refused to disappear. People spoke less openly about what had happened, yet they felt it in subtle ways. In moments of discomfort they could not explain. History has a way of absorbing cruelty and disguising it as routine. But some acts leave behind an echo that resists silence. The story did not end with the exchange, it only shifted form. It moved from an act into a memory, from memory into rumor, and from rumor into warning. Parents spoke of it indirectly, not as fact but as caution, reshaping it to suit their fears. Children grew up hearing fragments, sensing that something terrible had occurred without ever being told the truth. This distortion ensured the event would survive, not accurately, but persistently, mutating with each retelling. What made the legacy so enduring was the lack of resolution. There was no justice, no reckoning, no moment where the community collectively acknowledged what had been done. Without acknowledgement, guilt had nowhere to go. It dispersed instead, attaching itself to superstition, to moral storytelling, to whispered explanations of unrelated misfortune. When crops failed or illness spread, someone would remember the girl and wonder if the past was demanding recognition. The absence of records intensified the mystery. Official documents reduced lives to transactions, omitting the emotional cost entirely. This absence allowed imagination to fill the gaps, often in cruel ways. Over time, the girl became less human and more myth. Her suffering was abstracted, transformed into a symbol rather than a reality. In this form, she could be invoked without discomfort, used to reinforce lessons about obedience, poverty, or divine punishment. Generations later, the story persisted not because it was told clearly, but because it was never fully buried. It existed in half-remembered conversations, in the uneasy pauses when someone mentioned old debts or desperate bargains. These fragments created a sense that the past was unfinished, that something unresolved lingered beneath the present. The city moved forward, modernized, changed faces and structures, yet this story remained lodged in its foundation. The true horror of the legacy lies in what it normalized. By allowing such an act to fade without consequence, society quietly accepted its conditions as acceptable under extreme circumstances. This acceptance shaped future behavior, making exploitation easier to justify when survival was at stake. Each time desperation arose, the memory served as precedent, a reminder of how far one could go and still remain within the boundaries of social tolerance. For those who carried the memory most closely, the legacy was deeply personal. It lived in inherited shame, in family histories that avoided certain years, in names that were never used again. Trauma did not need to be explained to be felt. It passed through behavior, through silence, through an instinctive fear of debt and dependence. Even those who did not know the details sensed that something in the past had broken and never been repaired. The story's endurance also reveals how history selects what it preserves. Grand events are documented and celebrated, while quiet atrocities are left to decay into folklore. This imbalance ensures that suffering like hers remains marginal, easily dismissed as anecdote rather than evidence. Yet it is precisely these marginal stories that reveal the true character of an era, exposing the cost of stability and order. What survives is not just the memory of a child, but the structure that allowed her to be sacrificed. The legacy is embedded in attitudes toward poverty, in the moral flexibility granted to power, in the expectation that the vulnerable must adapt or disappear. These patterns outlast individuals, reproducing themselves in new contexts with familiar logic. To remember this story is to confront an uncomfortable continuity. It forces a recognition that the past is not distant but present, shaping responses to suffering even now. The whispers from Puebla are not only about one child or one debt, but about a recurring willingness to look away when survival is framed as justification. The legacy remains because it was never named properly, never faced directly, never mourned as it deserved. It lingers in the unresolved space between history and conscience, waiting quietly in the background of progress, a reminder that some debts are never truly paid, only transferred across time and memory.